Western leaders at the G7 summit pledged their continued support for Ukraine, including more sanctions against Moscow. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The Russia-Ukraine conflict, the rising cost of energy and global food shortages dominated talks at the G7 summit in the Bavarian Alps. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky joined the gathering by video link and again asked for more weapons to stop Russian advances. Ira Spitzer begins our coverage with this report.
A dramatic virtual visit and a show of support for Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky from the leaders of the G7 group of nations.
The G7 supporters of Ukraine around the world have to continue to help the Ukrainians to rebuild their economy, to get their grain out, to export their grain. And of course, we have to help them to protect themselves. And that's what we're going to continue to do.
On day 2 of their 3-day meeting in the Bavarian Alps, the world's wealthiest democracies issued a statement agreeing to support Kyiv in their conflict against Moscow for as long as it takes, and pledging $29.5 billion of aid. But with Russia continuing to hit at Ukrainian cities, including a strike on the capital Kyiv as the summit opened, there is the ever-present risk of the conflict widening.
That we are also cautious that we will help the Ukraine as much as is possible, but that we also avoid that there will be a big conflict between Russia and NATO, and this is what is of essence, to be tough and thinking about the necessities of the time we are living in.
The conflict in Ukraine has pushed global energy and food prices to record levels, creating economic uncertainty in the G7 countries and around the world. In addition to offering Kyiv financial support and weapons, sanctions have been a key part of the strategy to try and compel Moscow to stand down. The G7 leaders are planning to announce yet more measures targeting the Russian economy. The G7 members weren't the only world leaders participating at the summit. The heads of 5 other democracies, including India and South Africa, received invites to several meetings as well, in acknowledgement that for the G7 nations to turn their pledges into reality, they're going to need allies to help them get there. Ira Spitzer, CGTN, Bavaria.
For more now on the G7 summit, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He's a political and economic affairs commentator. Also with us from Bucharest is Klaus Lauries. He's a professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. From London, Marcus Papadopoulos is a historian, analyst, and author specializing in Russia. And Alexei Rabchen is an advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration of Ukraine. He joins us from Kyiv. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Alexei, if we look at the situation in Ukraine right now, just in the past 24 hours, we've had these reports of a shopping mall being hit by a missile. Ukraine says it was fired by Russia. One report that said that up to 13 people had been killed. What can you tell us about the status of the conflict right now?
Indeed, it was a big tragedy today in Kremenchuk when a shopping mall was deliberately hit by Russian missiles. Certain people has died and more than 40 yet left unknown because nobody knows what their fate is. It was a big fire in this shopping mall, and yesterday, literally a couple of kilometers from my house, I woke up from an explosion at 5 a.m. when Russian hit the residential building, killing one man and injured his 7-year-old daughter, and what is cynical, but his Russian wife, because she's Russian on passport, so Russia is killing the Russian citizen in injured in Kyiv. We see some of the advances of the Russian army here in Donbass, and we are waiting for more reserves to start fighting in different directions. We are waiting for more weapons to be sent to Ukraine and for our soldiers to be trained on it. And already we have HIMARS, so it's like very sophisticated missile machine that is already on a battlefield. We have a huge amount of howitzers that will definitely rebuild the balance what we now have on the battlefield. So we are waiting for more and more battles to come, unfortunately.
Marcus Papadopoulos, if we look at the situation in the eastern part of Ukraine, Russia has taken control of Severodonetsk as well as some small towns and villages in the east and some other areas, which includes a highway, which I understand is a major supply line for Ukrainian troops. Looking at these Russian advances, how does this change the battle in the east? And what do you think Russia's aim is? Is it to move westwards, or is it in a position where it's now consolidating what it's holding?
Well, currently speaking, the Russian army controls approximately 1/4 of Ukraine, which, given that the Russian military campaign in Ukraine is only a few months old, demonstrates that the Russian army's campaign has been thus far emphatically successful. Now, turning to the situation in the Donbass, some of the Ukrainian armies, or let me reword that, most of the Ukrainian army's best divisions are in the Donbass, and they are currently being ground down and devoured by Russian armed formations, backed by armed formations of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have either been killed, wounded, or taken prisoner so far in this war, most of them in the Donbass. And the Russian campaign in the Donbass is nearing its end. And I am of the opinion that once the Russian military campaign has been successful in the Donbass, the Russians will then look to capture what remains of the left bank of the river Dnipro, and then the Russian army will press on in the south with the objective of taking from the Ukrainian army what remains of Ukraine's Black Sea coastline. So, of course, I am referring to Odessa. And I have no doubt in my mind that by the start of next year or by the spring of next year, what remains of Ukraine's Black Sea coastline will be under the control of the Russian army.
All right, let me get a response from Alexei on that. Alexei, what do you make of what you just heard?
I guess, I will refer to the official statistic of the Ukrainian military commander that more than 30,000 Russian troops has been vanished, and you can multiply on 2 that more than 50 or 60,000 Russian best elite paratroopers were either killed or wounded. So the Russian lost almost 30 to 40 of their battlefield. They are trying to do the hidden mobilization, but they are so low on morale. Of course, they are outnumbered currently by the artillery or tanks, but their morale is so low, and the morale of Ukrainian soldiers who are defending their motherland is very high. And we are just waiting for more weapons to come. We already have very sophisticated missiles near Odessa, and we were able to sink a huge amount of Russian ships. And we are trying to advance also in the Black Sea to finish the food crisis that was artificially created by Russia. The same as an energy crisis and many other crises.
Okay.
We have more people in the reserves, and we are ready to fight back all of our territories that is temporarily occupied by Russians.
Klaus Loris, let's look at what's been happening over the past few weeks. I mean, we just heard over the past 24 hours that that shopping mall had been hit. There have been many casualties there. A few days ago, Ukraine was telling us that they were losing up to 200 people a day in the east. And as we just heard from Alexei, Russia has been losing forces as well. Now, NATO tells us that it will be supplying more weapons and equipment to Ukraine. They're talking about a new, more sophisticated communication system and an anti-drone system. And the United States has just announced that it will be supplying Ukraine with an air defense system. So where do you see this going?
Well, it is true that at the moment the military of the Russian forces are much more successful than they were in March when the G7 last met. And I think that is one of the main reasons why the G7, why in the next few days NATO meets in order to get the Western act together to agree on more weapons, on more ammunition for Ukraine. Because at the moment it's looking much less good than a few months before. I don't think it is, or I think it's premature to say the Russians have already won the war. As we just heard, there are also lots of problems within the Russian forces. The Russians are running out of ammunition as well, as do the Ukrainians. There are lots of problems which in the Russian economy, the Russian high technology area. The semiconductors, for example, have been banned, and the Russians find it very difficult to equip their forces with these semiconductors and that technology. So what we, I think, are heading for is for the next few weeks, we'll probably see that the Russians will make greater success, more success, but that in the end, the Ukrainians will also be able to push back, at least to some extent, the Russians, as they are supported new weaponry from the West and ammunition. So in the next few months, I would expect a stalemate, that neither side will be winning the war. Of course, you can argue that the Russians have already conquered, I think it's 10% of Ukrainian territory can be regarded as a success. And that is true to some extent. But Ukraine is adamant that the Russians need to be pushed back to the line of February 2022. And the West so far agrees with that. And I think the G7 meeting was also there to make sure that there is unanimity among the Western ranks, that there are no calls for negotiating with Putin at this stage and leaving Putin in possession of his conquered territory. And if Russia were to win the war and simply capturing that territory by force, that of course would send out a very poor signal to the rest of the world. Basically, you can make war, you can win, and everyone gives in. And I think that should not be the signal which the world will get from this war.
Aina Tang, and of course, these leaders meeting in the G7, they're looking at all kinds of measures that they can take against Russia, additional measures, I should say. They've been talked about more sanctions. But one of the efforts they're looking at to put more pressure on Russia is to cap the price of Russian oil on international markets. I'm not sure how this would work. What do you make of it? I mean, is this something where they could fix the price of another country's oil? Is that something that could work?
No, it doesn't work. I mean, it's just a kind of a suggestion that was thrown out there. Let's cap the amount of revenue that Russia is getting. Remember, the ruble is now much higher than it was before the conflict, and quite frankly, they're making a third more in terms of revenues, while literally exporting less oil. So at this juncture, this is an attempt to kind of stir the pot, but the rest of the Europeans are concerned by saying we'll only pay so much for gas. Russia will just simply cut them off, and that would be very, very, very difficult for a number of nations.
But wouldn't Russia be cutting its nose to spite its face then if it cuts off supplies of oil and gas to its customers? It won't be getting any income.
Well, quite frankly, Europe is not the main source of income anymore. They have diversified India, Sri Lanka, China, other places, Indonesia. Their oil is going all over the world. I mean, you have to think of oil as fairly fungible. If I don't buy it from here, somebody buys it from there. There's a certain amount of demand. And the question is, what is the supply? And at this point, there's a shortage in the supply because Russia was providing 30% of the world's energy. So at this point, it's both sides are trying to figure out how they can put the other side at disadvantage. You heard about, from your other guests about war. The fact is that Ukraine is unmatched in terms of Russia, but the question long term is, can Russia hold a large area of Ukraine that is hostile to it? There could be a lot of consequences there in terms of trying to, create a force that keeps this massive line of contention between what would be basically two countries. So, I mean, instead of looking at this in terms of, how you can prolong the war or making kind of victorious statements about, the valiant Ukrainians, the terrible Russians, the issue is that you have people who are dying. And when is that going to stop? At some point, there has to be negotiations. The question is when.
Alexei, President Zelensky, as we heard from our reporter, he addressed the G7 meeting via video link, and he said he would like this conflict to end by, well, the end of this year, the end of 2022. And I think that's the first time he's actually put a timeline on when he wants this conflict to be over. Why has he come up with a timeline? I mean, what's behind this?
I would say all the Ukrainians willing to have this war finish as soon as possible, because indeed people are dying, our economy is stagnating, we have lots of problems. With the hope that we will receive a huge amount of Russian frozen assets to reconstruct Ukraine. We already received several billions of dollars in our budget, and like huge amount of money as a pledge. We understand that it will take lots of time to rebuild our country, but like as you already know, like we become the candidates, we receive a candidate status to become a member of the European Union, and this inspires our nation, our soldiers so much that our children will be living in a better world, in a better country, and this was fighting. So I understand President Zelensky knows something and knows some plans when the more sophisticated weapon will come, when our soldiers and new reserves battalion will be returned from their training, and when we will start the counteroffensive operation. It's already been told that it will be in August or September, so we are waiting and creating some platform to return our territory and kick the Russians back to their homeland.
Klaus Laris, President Biden had a bilateral meeting with his German host, Olaf Scholz, on the sidelines of that G7 summit. And during that meeting, President Biden emphasized the need for unity among the North American countries, the United States and Canada, and its European allies. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
We have to stay together. Yeah. Because Putin has been counting on from the beginning. And somehow NATO would, and the G7 would splinter, but we haven't, and we're not going to. So can't let this aggression take the form it has and get away with it.
So, Klaus, President Biden there saying that NATO and the G7 have not splintered. Is that really true?
So far, I think it is largely true. And the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, got an awful lot of praise from Biden and from all the other participants. They congratulated him on having that turning point in German military and foreign policy, for dedicating more money to the military and showing a much more robust foreign policy, which he had announced in late February of this year. And everyone was full of praise for him. I think that was a sign they want to keep him on board, and they're not totally sure that he will stay on board. And the same to some extent also applies to Macron. Both Macron and Scholz have indicated that the war should be finished soon, that perhaps one should talk to Putin. And at the moment, that is not the American agenda, that is not what the Ukrainians want. And I think one reason why Zelensky said that the war should be finished by the winter was also as a signal to the European allies, to tell them the war will not go on forever. Just stay with us, be patient for another few months, and then we can come to an end of the war. So it really was also a certain lack of confidence in the European allies. But so far, I think this is not justified. The only European outlier so far is really Hungarian Prime Minister Orban, who is, of course, not part of the G7.
Okay, Marcus, what is your view on this? Are the Europeans and the Americans and the Canadians all marching in lockstep?
Well, let me be brutally candid about something. Has the American ruling elite, the Canadian ruling elite, and the British ruling elite asked their respective populations whether they are in support of hundreds of millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of pounds being sent to Ukraine? No, they have not done that, which really raises the question of whether the aforementioned countries, America, Canada, and Britain, are truly democratic. I urge people listening to this debate to familiarise themselves with the works of John Milton, John Locke, and John Stuart Mill, some of the finest minds the world has ever known concerning democracy and governance. They argued that when a government stops governing through the consent of the people, i.e., they are not governing by taking into consideration the interests of the people, then they are no longer a legitimate government. They are no longer a democracy. As a result of this economic crusade the West is prosecuting against Russia, the cost of living in, for example, Britain has skyrocketed. Inflation is soaring, and as a result, a recession is forthcoming. Many Britons face falling into poverty. Many British children face falling into poverty. More and more Britons will become dependent on food banks. And the West's crusade, economic crusade against Russia, is not guided by democracy or human rights or international law or for the welfare of the Ukrainian population.
Yeah.
No, not at all. It is all about great power rivalry, in that the West is attempting to enclose Russia on its western borders to weaken Russia in Europe and thereby weaken Russia in the world. Quite frankly speaking, anyone who believes that the war in Ukraine is a contest between good and bad, or freedom and tyranny, or civilization and savagery, is either exceedingly naive and ignorant or extremely dim-witted.
Anna Tangen, these G7 leaders meeting in Germany, they will meet in Spain over the next day with their NATO counterparts for a NATO summit. And before that summit, the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, he said, and I'm quoting him here, he said, Russia has walked away from the partnership and dialogue that NATO has tried to establish with Russia for many years. Has this what Russia has done, walked away from a partnership and dialogue that NATO has offered?
Well, I think it makes a good soundbite, but the fact is NATO tried to join, Russia tried to join NATO on 3 occasions. And Russia has been very, very clear every time there's been an expansion into what was previous Soviet bloc area, which they believe the West said that they would not do. So I think this is just rhetoric. I would, kind of just put it by the side.
Alexei, the British Prime Minister, as we heard in our report at the beginning of the show, Boris Johnson, he said that the G7 and Ukraine supporters, rather, around the world continue to help Ukraine build its economy. What kind of economic help is Ukraine getting from countries like Britain and other countries in NATO?
If I may to send a very kind word to Boris Johnson and all the British people who helped Ukraine, I would use this opportunity because, I guess Boris Johnson is now the second beloved politician in Ukraine after the President Zelensky, and we do understand that not only the West should pledge or should donate some money here. We're thinking about the investment, we're thinking about post-war recovery, we're thinking about the business opportunity, how to rebuild our country, how to make it more green and more energy efficient.
Right.
And I would love to reply to Marcus, very emotional speech when he blamed the democratic leader who helped in Ukraine. But I guess the reason of this is not the democratic leaders who are elected in democratic way. It's Putin. It's Putin who is doing the aggression. It's Putin who's trying to colonize Ukraine. It's Putin imperialism. It's only one person in the world willing to be in a history, and the whole democratic world is trying to resist it. So we understand that if one person will be allowed to conquer any other country, so it will be a disaster for the whole world. So it's priceless to have, and the West is paying only for money, but Ukrainians are paying with their life and blood for the democratic values, for their own countries, for making this world much better. So it's definitely the battle between the good and the bad.
Klaus Lares, NATO currently has 30,000 members, or troops rather, on high alert, but plans, they just announced that as well, they plan on raising that number sevenfold to 300,000. What does that mean, having 300,000 troops on high alert? Will these troops be deployed somewhere? I mean, where would these troops come from?
No, they will not be deployed, and these are the same troops which are already available. Only these troops will be put, as you said, on high alert. At the moment, there are only 40,000 troops on high alert that will be raised to 300,000. But these are not new troops. And that is a signal, and in reality, it doesn't mean all that much, but it is a signal to Putin that if he thinks of expanding the war, of going into, let's say, the Baltic states, Estonia, for example, that NATO is ready to, within a few days, to deploy troops, that Putin cannot expect to have a few weeks of warfare against Estonia alone without NATO being able to deploy rapid and well-equipped forces. It's a signal to Putin to be careful what he is doing about expanding the war. And can I just reply to one of the former speakers who said that the European population is not in support of the war? This is not true. There are serious inflation problems. There are serious coming recession problems and energy price hikes, clearly. However, so far, European public opinion is in support of Ukraine. They are supporting the administration.
Can you corroborate that with concrete evidence? Can you corroborate your assertion with concrete evidence? Evidence which would be used in a court of law. Can you corroborate that? How do you know that? Who told you that?
Public opinion polls.
No. So, corroborate your argument with evidence. Where's your evidence to support that assertion? That is a very serious assertion you've just made. I want to know what your evidence is.
With all respect, can I just finish my sentence?
Okay, yeah, go ahead, Klaus. One moment, Marcus. Klaus, finish what you were saying.
My evidence, if you please let me speak as well. Yes, you
go ahead, Klaus.
My evidence is public opinion polls in all European countries. There is worry, of course, that public opinion may change, but at the moment it has not changed. There's strong support for fighting the Russian aggressors. After all, Ukraine was invaded by Russia, not the other way around. Russia is the aggressor, and Russia needs to be repulsed. That is the overwhelming opinion and view of the European public. That may change, but at the moment it hasn't changed.
Okay. Anna Tangen, very quickly, one other issue discussed by the G7 leaders, unrelated to Ukraine, was that they pledged $600 billion to help developing countries build what they call climate resilient infrastructure. This is seen as something to counter or compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative. Do you think that's going to fly?
China's Belt and Road Initiative is the work of massive amounts of planning over many, many years. This is a piece of paper that was hurried out basically to create a theatrical number. Yeah. If you start looking at the details, there aren't any. Very few.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.